A Cheyenne scout in 1868 translated a peace treaty that said the opposite of what the general announced to both sides. But that lie is not the one that keeps me awake in a room full of shadows. It's the quiet, mechanical way I realized I had become the same kind of translation for my own life. I'm sitting here in this armchair in Ohio, the kind of chair that smells like dust and old Sunday papers, and the coffee in my mug went cold an hour ago. But the cold doesn't bother me because I've spent more time in the freezing dark than I care to count. You look at me and you see a guy who works in logistics, someone who manages the warehouse floor, someone who probably likes his steak medium rare and his Sunday football loud. That's the version I built for the world, but the version I'm talking about, the version that still sits in the back of a canvas-covered truck in a place where the sun turns everything the color of a bruised peach, that guy never really left. He's just waiting. He's waiting for the engine to cut out. He's waiting for the radio to crackle with that specific, static-heavy frequency that meant someone's day was about to end. Before all of that, I was just a kid from a town where the biggest news was a broken water main on Main Street, or the varsity team finally winning the regional playoffs after a decade of losing seasons. I remember the smell of the shop floor at my dad's garage, that sharp, metallic tang of motor oil and burnt rubber that somehow meant safety. I was 21, and my only real problem was trying to figure out how to tell Sarah that I was thinking about leaving. We had a porch swing that creaked in a rhythm I could hum in my sleep, and the summer nights were thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. I had a '69 Chevy that I was nursing back to life with spare parts and pure stubbornness, and I honestly thought that was as hard as life was going to get. You don't know what you don't know. You think life is a straight line, a paved road that leads from the high school graduation stage to a house with a mortgage and a dog. You don't realize the road isn't paved at all until you're already in the ditch, looking up at the sky, wondering how the stars look so different when you're thousands of miles away from everything you've ever loved. I joined because I wanted to be something more than a guy who fixed transmissions for his dad. It's that simple, and it's that stupid. There was this recruiter, a guy with a crew cut so tight it looked like it hurt, who sat me down in a room that smelled like floor wax and ambition. He didn't promise me glory. He just promised me a way out. A way to stand on my own 2 feet without the shadow of the hometown hanging over my head. I remember signing the paperwork with a pen that skipped on the paper, and the silence in that office was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My mom cried, not the loud, sobbing kind, but the quiet, terrified kind that pulls the air out of the room. My dad just shook my hand and told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the floor, at his own work boots, as if he could see the future in the scuff marks on the leather. The flight over felt like it lasted for years. I sat next to a guy named Miller who had a tattoo of a bulldog on his forearm and a nervous habit of clicking his pen until the spring snapped. We didn't talk about home. We talked about cars, about the shitty coffee in the terminal, about whether or not the food on the plane was actually edible. We were just boys trying to act like men, wearing uniforms that still had the factory creases in them. When we finally touched down, the heat hit us like a solid object. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the weight of it. It smelled like sulfur and burning diesel, a smell that becomes your baseline, the air you breathe until you forget that air is supposed to be clean. We were processed into the system, numbered and assigned, and just like that, the boy who liked working on Chevys in Ohio stopped existing. In his place was a serial number, a gear in a machine that was too big to comprehend and too blind to care. You learn real fast that the things they teach you in basic training are just the frame of the house. They don't tell you about the rot in the wood or the way the roof leaks when the storm hits. We were stationed at a place they called an FOB, a patch of dirt and concrete surrounded by razor wire, sitting in the middle of a desert that stretched out into nothingness. My unit was a mix of guys who were just as lost as I was, and we bonded in that desperate, frantic way that men do when they know they are in a blender. There was Miller, who kept the mood light by making fun of the Chow Hall's mystery meat, and Sergeant Vance, a man whose face was mapped by lines that suggested he'd seen more than any human being should have to hold. Vance didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He was the one who taught us that if you check your gear once, you check it twice, and if you have time to check it a third time, you do it anyway. He saved my life more times than I can count, and he never once asked for a thank you. That's the kind of love I'm talking about. A love that doesn't need words, just the quiet assurance that someone else is watching your back while you watch theirs. The days started to bleed into one another. It was a cycle of patrols, checkpoints, and waiting, the eternal, agonizing waiting. You'd go out, drive the same routes until you knew every pothole and every scrap of garbage on the side of the road, and then you'd come back and sit in the mess hall, staring at the walls, wondering if the next time you went out would be the last time you ever saw the inside of that room. You'd laugh at some stupid joke, something so ridiculous it wouldn't make sense to anyone back home, and for a second, the fear would just vanish. You'd feel a flicker of joy, a tiny spark of humanity that made you feel like you were still alive, still capable of laughter. And then, as quickly as it came, it would be gone, replaced by that cold, hollow feeling that sat in your gut like lead. You knew the joy was a lie. You knew it was a temporary truce with a reality that was actively trying to kill you. I remember this one afternoon. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray, and we were sitting on the edge of the perimeter, just watching the horizon. Miller was talking about this girl he met at a diner back in Nebraska, his eyes lighting up as he described the way she tied her hair back with a piece of blue ribbon. He didn't know yet that he wouldn't be going back to see her. He was laughing, a genuine, easy laugh, and for a moment I could almost hear the sound of the wind in the cornfields back home. It was so real, so vivid, that I could smell the dust on the road and feel the heat of the sun on my neck. I looked at him and I felt this sudden, crushing wave of gratitude for his existence, for the simple fact that we were sitting there, sharing a moment that felt like it belonged to a life that had nothing to do with this place. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to break the spell. I just wanted to hold onto that moment as long as I could, knowing full well that time was already running out. Tension is a funny thing. You think it's something that builds up and then explodes, but it's not. It's a constant, vibrating hum in the marrow of your bones. It's the way your skin prickles when you hear a sound you can't identify, the way your grip tightens on your rifle when the shadows lengthen across the sand. We were out on patrol, just a standard run through a village that looked like it had been forgotten by time, when the air changed. It didn't shift in a way you could measure. It just felt heavier, more concentrated. The silence wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, a dull, insistent rhythm that felt like a countdown. I glanced at Vance, who was walking point, his eyes scanning the rooftops with a focus that was almost predatory. He didn't look at me, but I knew he felt it too. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic, like copper on the tongue. We reached the center of the market square, a cluster of mud brick walls and open stalls that stood silent in the midday heat. There wasn't a soul in sight, not a stray dog, not a child, nothing. That was when I knew. The instinct that had been dormant for months suddenly flared to life, a primal, warning pulse that screamed at me to run. I looked at Miller, who was checking his watch, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I felt the words dying in my throat before I could even find them. I wanted to tell him to move, to get to cover, to just stop, but the words were caught, stuck behind a wall of pure, unadulterated fear. The world seemed to slow down, the light stretching out into long, thin filaments that caught the dust motes dancing in the air. I saw a bird flutter up from a nearby alley, its wings beating in a slow, rhythmic motion that felt impossibly loud in the dead stillness of the square. Vance stopped in his tracks, his hand raised in a signal that was already too late. He didn't shout, he didn't even turn around. He just tilted his head, listening to something that the rest of us couldn't yet hear. The sound started low, a vibration that traveled through the soles of my boots and settled deep into my joints. It wasn't an explosion yet, but it was the promise of one, the inevitable conclusion to a sentence that had been written the moment we set foot on that dirt. I could feel the sweat cooling on my forehead, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. My hands felt clumsy, the weight of my rifle suddenly monstrous, an anchor dragging me down into the earth. I knew what was coming. I knew that in the next few seconds, everything that we were, everything we hoped to be, was going to be folded into that single, violent moment. I looked down at the ground and saw a single blue ribbon lying in the dirt, half buried in the dust. My mind jumped back to Miller's story, to the girl in the diner, and I felt a pang of something so sharp it almost brought me to my knees. It was a bizarre, disconnected thought, a stray fragment of a life I was no longer sure existed. I wanted to pick it up, to hold it like a talisman, but I knew that if I moved, the fragile balance of the world would finally shatter. The air seemed to coalesce around us, a pressure cooker of waiting that was reaching its breaking point. Every detail, the scuff on my boot, the way the sunlight hit the corner of a ruined building, the sound of my own pulse ringing in my ears, seemed to be branded into my consciousness. I wasn't just observing it anymore. I was part of the architecture of the moment, a piece of a history that hadn't happened yet. Vance took a half step forward, his gaze fixed on a doorway obscured by a heavy, sun-bleached cloth. He didn't speak, but his posture changed, his shoulders squaring as if he were preparing to carry the weight of the entire world on his back. I could feel the others tensing up behind me, a collective, involuntary shift that rippled through the group. We were 6 men, 6 stories, 6 lives that had converged on this single, dusty square, and we were all, in our own way, reaching the same realization. The war wasn't a game, it wasn't a mission, and it wasn't a job. It was a finality. It was a place where all the variables of our lives were being stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of what it means to be alive and to know that you might not be for much longer. The cloth over the doorway moved, a subtle, almost imperceptible flick in the heat haze. It wasn't a wind, it was a presence. I saw Vance's hand go to his side, his movements liquid and practiced, the grace of a man who had made his peace with the inevitable. He glanced back at us, just for a fraction of a second, and in that look I saw everything he'd ever tried to hide. There was no fear there, no hesitation, only a profound, heartbreaking clarity. He was looking at us, at Miller, at me, at the kids who thought they were going to come home and resume their lives as if nothing had ever happened. He was looking at us with a kind of pity that hurt more than any bullet could. And then he turned back to the doorway, his body becoming a shield, a barrier between us and the thing that was waiting on the other side. The silence grew so intense it felt like it was ringing in my ears, a high-pitched, insistent frequency that drowned out the world. I could hear my own breathing, short, shallow gasps that barely reached my lungs. I looked at Miller again, and he was smiling, a faint ghost of a smile that made my stomach turn. He had his rifle pointed at the doorway, his finger hovering near the trigger, his expression one of total, calm focus. He didn't know. He still thought we were going to get back, that there was a burger and a life, and a girl with a blue ribbon waiting for us on the other side of this. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a physical manifestation of the tragedy that was about to unfold, but I swallowed it down, forcing my face into a mask of stone. I had to be strong. I had to be there with him. I had to witness it because that was the only thing I could do. The air began to shimmer, the heat playing tricks on our eyes, distorting the edges of the buildings, until the world looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my side, a phantom sensation that made me wonder if I'd already been hit. I checked my chest, my arms, my legs, nothing. Just the weight of the gear, the sweat, the crushing pressure of the atmosphere. I looked back to the doorway and the cloth had stopped moving. It was hanging there, perfectly still, as if it were holding its breath alongside us. The sun was beating down on the back of my neck, a relentless, burning heat that felt like a judgment. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my entire reality narrowing down to that one insignificant piece of fabric. I knew that as soon as it moved again, as soon as that doorway decided to give up its secret, the story of my life would be cut in two before and everything that came after. I shifted my weight, the gravel crunching under my boot with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the vacuum of that square. Miller looked at me, a brief, questioning glance, and I just shook my head, my eyes locked on the doorway. I couldn't explain what I felt, couldn't put into words the terror, the love, the overwhelming sense of doom that was washing over me. I just wanted to tell him that I was glad we were there together, that he was the best man I'd ever known, but the words felt too heavy to carry. So I just held my breath, the way he was, the way the air was, the way the entire universe seemed to be doing at that exact, terrifying second. The cloth moved again, but this time it didn't just flick. It was pulled back slowly, deliberately, by a hand that I couldn't see, a hand that was the catalyst for everything that was about to happen. My finger found the trigger, the cold metal biting into my skin, the only reality in a world that had suddenly become a dream. I wasn't scared anymore. The fear had been replaced by a strange, crystalline calm, the kind of stillness you feel when you're standing on the edge of a cliff and you know there's no way back. I watched the dark space behind the cloth, waiting for the shadow to take shape, for the world to reveal its true face. Vance had his weapon raised, his posture tense and ready, his silhouette etched against the glare of the sun. He looked like a statue, a monument to a sacrifice he was about to make without a moment's hesitation. I thought about the garage back in Ohio, the smell of the motor oil, the sound of the creaking porch swing, the way the light filtered through the trees on a lazy Sunday afternoon. It all felt like a movie I'd seen a long time ago, a story about a person who didn't exist anymore. I was here in the dirt, in the middle of a war that didn't have a name, waiting for a doorway to reveal the ending I'd been walking towards since the day I signed those papers in that room full of floor wax. I could feel the pulse of the world, the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the earth beneath my feet, and I knew that whatever happened in the next breath, I was never going to be the same. The cloth was almost fully drawn back, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of movement in the dark, a shadow within a shadow. I blinked, trying to clear the sweat from my eyes, trying to see it, to know it, to be ready for the moment the world finally decided to stop spinning. My heart gave one last, violent thump against my ribs, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes at the end, that this was the last thing I would ever see the way I used to see. Everything was about to change. Everything was about to go silent. I just didn't know yet how loud the silence would be. The cloth didn't just fall, it vanished as if it had been vaporized, and the sudden gap in the brickwork revealed a darkness that felt colder than the desert sun had any right to allow. Vance took a half step, a single fluid movement that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years, and then the world stopped being a sequence of events and became a singular, deafening roar. There was no time to process the sight of the flash, the sudden, violent displacement of air that knocked the breath clean out of my lungs, or the way the sunlight seemed to shatter like glass. I remember the ground rising up to meet me, not because I fell, but because the earth itself seemed to buck like a panicked animal. Everything turned into a kaleidoscope of gray, brown, and a searing metallic white that burned into my retinas. I felt the pressure wave slam into my chest, a physical blow that threw me backward, and for a few seconds the only thing I knew was the taste of grit and the smell of ozone that surged up from the crater the world had suddenly become. I tried to scream, but the air was gone, replaced by a vacuum that wouldn't let me draw a single shallow breath. When my hearing started to crawl back, it didn't come in a rush. It came in jagged, distorted pulses, like a radio struggling to hold a signal through a storm. I heard the ringing, that high-pitched, insistent whine that drowns out everything else, and underneath it, a sound that felt like the earth grinding its teeth. I pushed myself up, my palms sliding over the loose, scorched gravel, and I looked at where the doorway had been. It was gone. The wall was a jagged, smoking ruin, and the dust was so thick it turned the afternoon into a twilight that choked the lungs. I couldn't find Vance. I couldn't find Miller. I could only see the swirling, suffocating gray, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was the only thing left alive in the entire world. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, like they were made of heavy, rusted iron, and I stumbled toward the wreckage. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The silence that followed the blast was worse than the explosion itself. It was a hungry, predatory quiet that seemed to be waiting for me to acknowledge what it had taken. I found Miller first, or what was left of his posture, huddled near the edge of the crater. He wasn't moving, and the stillness in his shoulders, that usually easy, relaxed slouch, was gone, replaced by a rigidity that looked unnatural. I didn't want to touch him. I didn't want to confirm the thing that my eyes were already reporting, but I reached out, my fingers trembling so hard they felt like they were vibrating off my hands. I touched his shoulder and he didn't turn. He didn't make a sound. There was a faint, lingering heat coming off his uniform, the smell of cordite and dry, parched earth clinging to him like a shroud. I looked for his watch, that cheap, digital thing he was always checking, but his wrist was obscured by the wreckage of a support beam that had been tossed aside like a toothpick. I sat down next to him, and for the first time since leaving Ohio, I felt a laugh rising in my throat, not a happy laugh, but a dry, jagged thing that rattled in my chest because the absurdity of it was too much to hold. He was going to get that burger. He had mentioned it, decided on it, and now he was going to be forever hungry, a ghost stuck in a desert that didn't know his name. I turned away, my vision tunneling down until the whole world was just the jagged edge of a brick and the way the dust settled on the back of my hand. I couldn't find Vance. I scanned the square, moving my head in slow, rhythmic jerks, terrified that I'd see him in pieces, more terrified that I wouldn't see him at all. Then I saw a boot, protruding from a pile of rubble near the center of the blast radius. It was buckled and torn, the laces frayed, and I knew it was his. I didn't go over. I couldn't. I stayed there with Miller, my hand resting on his back, feeling the slow cooling of his spirit, and I watched the sky above the village. It hadn't changed. The sun was still beating down, the heat was still rising in shimmering waves, and the birds, the same ones that had fluttered up before the explosion, were circling back to the rooftops, indifferent to the fact that the floor had dropped out of the world. The callousness of the sky felt like a betrayal. How could the world keep spinning when the gravity of our lives had been so completely torn away? The radio in my pocket crackled, a sudden, sharp burst of white noise that made me jump so hard I nearly collapsed. I pulled it out, my fingers fumbling with the volume, and I heard the distant, tinny voice of the command post, asking for a status report. They sounded so far away, so clinical, so unaware of the fact that the universe had just ended. I tried to speak, but my throat was closed off, a knot of grief and shock that wouldn't let the words pass. I just held the radio to my ear, listening to the static, a sound that suddenly reminded me of the television back home on a channel that had lost its signal. I felt a surge of rage, cold and hard and absolute, directed at the voice on the other end at the base at the entire concept of the mission. They wanted a status report. They wanted a string of numbers to justify the silence. I sat there in the dust, the sun burning into my skin, and I didn't answer. I just clicked the radio off and let the silence swallow us again. I had to move, I knew that. The rules were drilled into me. You don't stay in the kill zone, you don't wait for the secondary, you don't become a sitting duck. but my body wouldn't listen. It wanted to sit there, to stay with Miller, to wait for someone to come and tell me it was all a mistake, that we were just back in the mess hall and this was a fever dream caused by the heat. I closed my eyes, and for a second I was back on that porch swing in Ohio. I could hear the chain creaking, the rhythm steady and comforting, and I could smell the damp, sweet scent of the yard after a spring rain. It was so vivid, so sharp, that I could almost feel Sarah's hand on my arm, the warmth of her skin, the way her hair smelled like vanilla and sunshine. I leaned into the memory, letting it pull me away from the dust and the cordite, letting it drown out the sight of the ruined wall. If I stayed in that memory long enough, maybe I could just drift out of the desert entirely. Maybe I could just wake up in my own bed, the garage quiet, the tools neatly arranged on the workbench, the future still a wide, unpaved road waiting for me to drive it. Then a piece of debris shifted nearby, a dull, heavy thud, and the memory shattered. I was back. The dust was still thick, the silence was still heavy, and the reality was still as brutal as a hammer blow. I opened my eyes and looked at Miller, his face obscured by the shadow of the wall. I felt a sudden, frantic need to apologize to him, to say I was sorry for not telling him to move, for not seeing the signs, for being the one who was still breathing while he was just a weight in the dirt. But the words died before they could reach my lips. What would they mean now? Nothing. Words are for people who have the luxury of time, and we had run out of that a lifetime ago. I stood up, my knees aching, my gear feeling like a mountain of dead weight on my back, and I began to search. I went to the boot, the one that stuck out of the rubble, and I cleared away the stones with my bare hands. My fingernails tore, the skin scraped raw, but I didn't feel it. I just kept digging until I saw the shape of a leg, and then slowly the rest of him. Vance was trapped, his legs pinned by a fallen beam, but he was alive. His eyes, when they met mine, were clouded with pain, but they were still his eyes, the same eyes that had watched over us for months, the same eyes that had seen everything and refused to blink. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg for help. He just looked at me, a brief, sharp nod that said everything that needed to be said. He knew. He looked at Miller, then back at me, and his expression shifted, a flicker of something that looked like regret, but it wasn't for himself. It was for us. It was for the fact that we had been left here in this ruin to carry the memory of what had just happened. I moved to the beam, wedging my shoulder against it, and I pushed. I pushed until the veins in my neck stood out like cords, until my vision went black at the edges, until I felt my own muscles start to tear. It didn't move. It was fixed, a heavy, unyielding part of the landscape. I stopped and looked at him, my breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. He nodded again, a slow, deliberate movement of his head, and he whispered something, a single word that I couldn't catch over the ringing in my ears. I leaned closer, my face inches from his, and he whispered it again. It wasn't a request for help. It was a command. He told me to go. He told me to leave him and to get out of the square, to move, to find a way to make it count. The look in his eyes was so fierce, so demanding, that it felt like a physical weight pressing me backward. I wanted to scream, to tell him I wasn't leaving, that we were a team, that we didn't abandon our own, but the truth was sitting there, heavy and undeniable, between us. He was done. He had given everything, and the only thing he had left to give was the chance for me to survive. I stood up, my chest heaving, and I looked at him one last time, trying to etch every detail of his face into my memory, the lines, the dirt, the stoic, unbreakable strength of him. I walked away. Every step felt like a betrayal, a conscious, deliberate choice to leave behind the best part of who I was. I didn't look back. I knew if I looked back, I'd never be able to keep moving. I kept my gaze fixed on the edge of the square, on the sliver of sunlight that promised a way out, and I forced my legs to work. One, then two, then three. The ground seemed to stretch, the distance growing with every stride, but I didn't stop. I could hear the wind picking up, a low, mournful howl that swirled through the ruins of the village, and it sounded like the voices of all the men who had ever walked this earth and never come home. I reached the edge of the square, the threshold between the hell we'd found and the vast, indifferent desert beyond, and I stopped. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless, undulating sea of sand that held no mercy, no memory, no future. The radio buzzed again, the same persistent, annoying sound, and this time I reached for it, my fingers shaking as I pressed the button. I didn't speak. I just held the channel open, listening to the static, listening to the world that was moving on without us. I was alive. The realization didn't bring me joy or relief or even a sense of pride. It brought only a deep, hollow exhaustion, a feeling of being a shell of a man, inhabited by a ghost. I turned and looked back one last time, just a fleeting glance, and saw the ruins still sitting there, the smoke rising into the clear blue sky like a silent prayer. The village was gone, the wall was gone, and the men I had called brothers, the men who had laughed at bad coffee and dreamt of girls with blue ribbons, were gone. I was alone, and I was still standing. That was the most devastating thing of all. I turned toward the desert, my boots sinking into the soft, shifting sand, and I started the long, lonely walk back to a life that no longer had a place for me. The heat was beginning to wane, the light shifting into that long, bruised purple that signals the end of a day in this place. I kept walking, my pace steady, my eyes scanning the terrain with a focus that was automatic, a survival instinct that had been hammered into me until it was part of my bone structure. I didn't think about the past, and I didn't think about the future. I only thought about the next step. If I thought about anything else, the dam would break, and I knew that if the dam broke, there would be nothing left to hold me together. I remembered the feeling of the steering wheel in that '69 Chevy, the way it felt solid and reliable under my hands, and I tried to replace the feeling of the rifle strap cutting into my shoulder with that memory. It didn't work. The grit of the desert was in my teeth, the smell of smoke was in my hair, and the weight of what I had left behind was a phantom limb I could feel clutching at my heart. I saw a patrol truck in the distance, a small, dark shape silhouetted against the rising moon, and I raised my hand. They didn't see me at first, the truck continuing on its path, and for a terrifying second, I thought they would just pass me by, that I would be left to wander the desert until I vanished into the sand. I stood there, my hand frozen in the air, and I let out a sound, not a shout, but a low, desperate groan that felt like it had been held inside me for a century. The truck slowed, the brake lights flaring red in the darkness, and I felt a strange, cold wave of relief wash over me. They were coming back. They were going to pick me up, take me to a place with lights and noise and people, and they were going to pretend that nothing had changed. They were going to ask for a report, and I was going to have to find a way to translate the horror into something they could fit into a file. As the truck drew closer, I could hear the engine, a steady, rhythmic thrum that sounded like a heartbeat. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of anger at the noise, at the way the world refused to stop for the tragedy that had just occurred. Why were they still moving? Why was the world still functioning? Why wasn't the sky falling? The truck pulled up alongside me, the dust billowing in a cloud that obscured the headlights, and a soldier leaned out the window, his face illuminated by the dash lights. He looked so young, so untouched, with eyes that hadn't seen the ruin of a wall or the look in Vance's eyes when he knew it was over. He looked at me, at my dusty uniform, at the empty, hollow expression I was sure was carved into my face, and he asked if I was okay. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I was the farthest thing from okay that had ever existed. Instead, I just nodded, a slow, stiff motion of my head, and I climbed into the back. The ride back to the FOB was a blur of shadows and light, the landscape sliding past in a monotonous, meaningless parade of rock and sand. I sat in the corner, my back against the metal wall of the truck, and I watched the others. There were 3 of them talking about something, their voices low and muffled by the engine noise. They were sharing a pack of cigarettes, the smoke curling up into the dark, and they were laughing at something one of them said. The laughter was like a knife in my gut. How could they laugh? How could they exist in the same world as the one I had just left behind? I wanted to shout at them, to demand they stop, to force them to acknowledge the void that had just opened up. But I didn't. I just sat there, my hands locked in my lap, and I let the darkness consume me. I was a stranger to them, a ghost in a uniform, someone who had seen behind the curtain and knew the truth of what was playing out on the stage. When we reached the gate, the perimeter lights flared to life, a blinding, artificial glare that made me squint. The base was exactly as I had left it, the same concrete barriers, the same razor wire, the same sense of mundane, suffocating routine. I felt a surge of nausea, a physical repulsion toward the safety of the base. This wasn't safety, this was a lie. This was a place where people pretended that the world was still sane, that the rules still applied, that life was a straight, paved road. I climbed out of the truck, my legs shaking, and I walked toward the barracks, the sound of my boots on the gravel echoing in the quiet night. I passed the mess hall, the place where we had shared that final, mundane meal, the place where Miller had joked about the food, and I felt a phantom presence beside me. I could almost see him, hear his laugh, smell the scent of his skin, and I had to stop and lean against a wall, the grief finally, inevitably, catching up to me. I reached the barracks and went inside, the air smelling of stale sweat and old laundry. It was quiet, the other guys already asleep, the silence so heavy it felt like a blanket pressing down on my chest. I walked to my bunk, the one I had shared with Miller, and I sat down on the edge, the mattress sagging under my weight. His cot was empty, the sheets perfectly made, the pillow untouched, and the sight of it was more than I could bear. I leaned forward, burying my face in my hands, and I let the tears come. They didn't come in a rush, they came in long, slow, agonizing gasps, a release of all the horror, the guilt, and the grief I had been holding back since the moment the world fell apart. I cried for Miller, for Vance, for the girl with the blue ribbon, and for the boy who had once been me, the one who thought life was a straight, paved road. I cried until there was nothing left, until my body was empty, until the only thing remaining was the cold, hollow ache of being alive. I laid down on the cot, the thin, scratchy blanket pulled up to my chin, and I stared at the ceiling. The light from outside filtered through the window, casting long, strange shadows across the room, and I watched them move, a silent, spectral dance. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doorway, the cloth moving, the flash, the way the wall disintegrated into dust. I saw Vance's eyes, the way they held that final, heartbreaking clarity, and I heard the voice in my head, the one that told me to go, to move, to survive. Was I surviving? Or was I just waiting for the next explosion, the next ending, the next piece of my soul to be torn away? I felt a sudden, desperate urge to reach out to someone, to call home, to hear a voice that reminded me of who I used to be. But what would I say? How could I explain that the world I was living in was a place of horrors, that I was a man who had seen things that didn't belong in a civilized life? I rolled over, my back to the empty cot, and I tried to focus on the sound of the bass, the distant hum of the generators, the occasional sound of a truck moving along the perimeter, the wind rattling the metal roof. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat that I had to learn to live by if I was going to make it out of this place. I was still here. That was the only fact that mattered. The rest, the grief, the guilt, the horror, it was just the background radiation of a war that had become my entire existence. I closed my eyes, and this time I didn't see the doorway. I saw the garage back in Ohio, the smell of motor oil, the sound of the wind in the trees, the way the light filtered through the leaves. I held onto that image, the only anchor I had in a sea of shifting, dangerous currents, and I waited for the morning to come, knowing that when it did, I would have to get up, put on my uniform, and do it all over again. The morning light was a harsh, unforgiving gray that bled through the barracks window, turning the room into a cage of sharp lines and muted colors. I sat up, my body stiff and aching, every movement a reminder of the physical cost of the day before. I could hear the bass coming to life, the clatter of gear, the sound of boots on gravel, the low, monotone murmur of voices, the sharp bark of an order issued somewhere down the row. It was a machine that never stopped, a beast that consumed time and people with the same indifferent efficiency. I washed my face in the communal sink, the cold water stinging my skin, and I stared at myself in the cracked, salt-stained mirror. I didn't recognize the person staring back. The eyes were older, the jawline set in a way that wasn't there before, and the ghost of the boy from Ohio had been erased, replaced by someone who was hard, hollow, and utterly lost. I walked to the mess hall, the path feeling like a bridge I had already crossed 1,000 times. The guys were there, sitting at the long metal tables, the sound of their voices a dull, constant drone. They were eating, talking, living, the simple, miraculous act of existence continuing as if nothing had happened, as if the earth hadn't just swallowed 2 of our own. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of anger again, a hot, liquid heat that burned in my stomach. I wanted to shake them, to pull them out of their complacency, to tell them that death wasn't a statistic, that it was a visceral, bloody, absolute end. But I sat down, my tray in front of me, and I stared at the eggs, the gray, rubbery substance that passed for breakfast. I couldn't eat. I could only sit there, feeling the weight of the air, the pressure of the space where Miller and Vance should have been, the phantom presence of their absence, a hole in the fabric of the room that no one else seemed to notice. The day stretched out in front of me, a long, empty horizon of patrols and checklists, a repeat of the cycle that had led us to that doorway. I stood up, my tray clattering as I set it on the rack, and I walked out into the heat, the sun already burning through the thin haze of dust. The desert was waiting, a vast, beautiful, terrible expanse that felt like it was watching, judging, holding its breath for the next inevitable event. I felt a sudden, frantic need to be anywhere else, to run until the air changed, until the smell of ozone was gone, until the sound of the explosion stopped ringing in my ears. But I was here. I was caught in the architecture of the war, a gear in the machine, and the only thing I could do was to continue, to put one boot in front of the other, and to hope that if I just kept moving, I wouldn't have to face the truth of what I had become. I walked toward the motor pool, my boots kicking up small, clouds of dust that hung in the still, heavy air. I saw the trucks, the same ones that had carried us out on that fatal patrol, sitting in a neat, orderly row, their engines silent, their presence a haunting reminder of the journey we had taken. I reached my assigned vehicle, the one I had driven, the one that had carried us into that square, and I stopped. I ran my hand along the metal, the surface cool and gritty, and I felt a strange, inexplicable sense of grief, a mourning for the machine itself, for the fact that it was still here, still whole, while the men who had occupied it were not. I opened the door and climbed inside, the interior smelling of sweat and old plastic, a small, enclosed world that felt like the only sanctuary I had left. I sat there, the silence pressing in on me, and I waited for the order to move, for the mission to continue, for the world to keep dragging me through the dirt. The radio buzzed, a sharp, metallic sound that pierced the quiet of the cab, and I reached for the handset, my fingers stiff and uncooperative. The voice on the other end was clipped, efficient, a series of coordinates and objectives that didn't have any relation to the reality of the dust and the heat and the blood. I listened, my mind detached, my focus narrowed to the task, the work, the survival. I replied with a simple, hollow acknowledgement, the words feeling like a foreign language in my mouth. I was a professional. I was a soldier. I was a cog in the machine. And I was going to do what I was told because the alternative, the act of thinking, of feeling, of remembering, was an unbearable burden that I couldn't carry. I started the engine, the roar filling the cab and drowning out the quiet, and I turned the truck toward the gate, toward the desert, toward the next, inevitable and potentially final, stage of the story. The hum of the tires on the dirt road was a constant, hypnotic sound, a rhythm that I could have followed for an eternity. I stared at the landscape, the same rolling dunes, the same jagged rock formations, the same endless stretch of nothingness that had defined our lives for so long. Every turn was a reminder, a marker of a path that we had traveled, a geography of loss that I was slowly and painfully mapping in my own head. I saw a group of kids playing near a village, their laughter carrying on the wind, a sound that felt like a slap in the face. How could they play? How could they exist in this place, in this war, in this world, without being consumed by the same terror that had shattered us? I looked at them, really looked at them, and I saw not just children but the future, a future that was being shaped by the same cruel and indifferent forces that had claimed Miller and Vance. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, insistent rhythm that felt like a trap. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, my hands trembling with the effort of holding the truck steady. I was a man on the edge, a frayed, broken thing that was being held together by nothing more than the sheer force of habit and the crushing weight of expectation. I was supposed to be a leader, a veteran, someone who could guide the others, who could make the calls, who could ensure that we all came back, but I couldn't even keep myself together. I was a hollow man, a vessel for all the things I couldn't say, for all the things I couldn't forget, for all the things that I had been forced to witness. I was a translator of nightmares, a courier of shadows, and I was expected to just keep driving, to just keep moving, to just keep fulfilling the mission. The truck jolted as I hit a rut in the road, the vibration traveling through my arms and settling deep into my bones. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my shoulder, a phantom injury that flared in sympathy with the memory of the weight of the beam I had tried to lift. I pushed it down, the same way I pushed down everything, the grief, the guilt, the horror, the longing for a life that was already a fading dream. I stared at the horizon, the line where the earth met the sky, a thin, shimmering sliver of light that held the only hope I had. I was going to survive. That was the only thing I had left to believe in, the only thing that kept me from simply stopping the truck, walking out into the sand, and letting the desert take me. I was going to make it out, and I was going to find a way to live with the man I had become, a man who had seen the end of the world and was still somehow, miraculously, absurdly standing. We reached the outskirts of a town, a cluster of buildings that looked like they had been built out of the earth itself, a ragged, desperate patchwork of survival. I slowed the truck, my eyes scanning the streets, the windows, the doorways, looking for the same sign, the same warning, the same inevitable threat that we had found before. Everything was still, a silence that felt heavy and expectant, a breath that was being held by the very stones of the houses. I felt the same familiar, cold prickle of terror on my skin, the same primal warning that pulsed in my veins, the same desperate knowledge that we were walking into another trap. I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. I kept the truck moving, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, my hands tight on the wheel, my entire being braced for the next impact, the next shock, the next moment when the world would finally, mercifully, decide to end. I watched a doorway, the same kind of doorway, covered by a piece of fabric that flickered in the hot, stagnant air. I felt the pulse of the world, the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the earth beneath my tires, and I knew that whatever happened in the next breath, I was ready. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that other square, that other life, that other, innocent and doomed reality. I was someone else, someone who knew the cost, someone who had already lost everything, someone who was not afraid because there was nothing left to fear. The cloth moved, a subtle, almost imperceptible flick, and I didn't blink. I gripped the wheel, I pressed my foot to the floor, and I drove, a man on a collision course with destiny, heading straight into the heart of the shadow, waiting for the silence to finally, definitively return. The flight home was a 14-hour crawl through the stratosphere, a hollowed-out tube of aluminum filled with the heavy, pressurized silence of 200 men who had all seen the same ghosts but were currently pretending they hadn't. I sat in the middle row, my knees pulled tight against the seat in front of me, staring at the back of a head that wasn't there. When the wheels finally touched down on American soil, a violent, jarring thud that sent a shudder through the entire fuselage, nobody cheered. Nobody stood up. We just sat there, listening to the hydraulics whine and the engines spool down, trapped in the collective realization that we were back in a place where we didn't belong anymore. I looked out the tiny, scratched window at the runway, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement like stars in a night sky I didn't recognize, and I felt a terror so cold it turned my blood to ice. I was going to have to walk out of that plane and pretend I was the same man who had walked into it, even though the man who had left the desert had died in a square, buried under a pile of broken brick in silence. The terminal was a blur of fluorescent lights and the sharp, antiseptic smell of cleaning chemicals that hit my nose like a physical blow. I walked through the sliding glass doors, my duffel bag a lead weight on my shoulder, and I saw her. She was standing by the arrival's gate, wearing that blue coat I remembered from a lifetime ago, her eyes scanning the crowd with a frantic, desperate hope that made my throat close up. She saw me, and for a second she just froze, the smile dying on her lips as she took in the version of me that had arrived instead of the one she had sent away. We collided in the middle of the crowded floor, a hug that was supposed to be the moment I had dreamt of for months, but as I held her, I felt the gap between us like a canyon. I was still smelling the ozone and the dust, still feeling the weight of that beam on my shoulder, still seeing Miller's face in the shade of the ruin, and her perfume, that soft vanilla scent that used to ground me, only made the disconnect worse. I wasn't there. I was still in the square. The drive home was a slow, agonizing trek through familiar streets that looked like a movie set I had once lived on. Every traffic light, every sign, every house with its manicured lawn and porch light glowing in the dark, felt like an insult. How could these people be living their lives, sleeping in their beds, complaining about the weather, while the world had been hollowed out? I watched the road, my foot hovering over the brake, scanning the shadows beneath every parked car for the glint of a tripwire. When we pulled into the driveway, the silence of the neighborhood was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I walked through the front door, the wood floors creaking under my boots in the exact same rhythm I had memorized as a child, and I stood in the kitchen, the light humming above the island. I looked at the coffee maker, the mail stacked neatly on the counter, the magnet holding a grocery list to the fridge, and I felt like an intruder in my own life. That first night was a slow war of attrition against the darkness. I lay in our bed, the sheets crisp and smelling of lavender, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the silence to stop screaming. Every sound, the settling of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rustle of leaves, was a trigger, a reminder of the quiet that comes right before the floor drops out of the universe. Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing steady and soft, a rhythm that used to be my anchor, but now it felt like a barrier between us. I couldn't touch her. I couldn't explain that if I moved, if I breathed too loud, the illusion of safety would shatter and I would be back in the rubble. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my muscles locked in a permanent, agonizing state of hypervigilance, and I waited for the sun to rise so I could stop pretending to be a man who was still capable of sleep. The weeks that followed were a long, quiet drowning. I went to the VA, sitting in a beige room with a stack of magazines I couldn't read and a clock on the wall that ticked with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The man across from me, a counselor with a soft voice and eyes that had never seen a war, asked me to tell him what I was feeling, and I just looked at him until he stopped talking. I couldn't tell him. The language didn't exist for it. How do you describe the sound of a wall turning into vapor? How do you describe the way your best friend's life just stops, like a radio being unplugged, while the rest of the world keeps singing? I stopped going. I started taking long drives at 3 in the morning, finding the darkest roads I could, just to feel the vibration of the engine in my palms and to be away from the stifling, dangerous safety of a house that felt like a trap. I remember one dinner, about 3 months after I got back. We were sitting at the table, my parents were there, and the air was filled with the clatter of silverware and the sound of someone laughing at a story I wasn't listening to. I reached for the salt, and the sudden, sharp scrape of the shaker against the table sounded exactly like the safety clicking off on a rifle. My body reacted before my brain could stop it. I was under the table, my hand balled into a fist, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The room went silent, the laughter dying instantly, and I stayed there on the linoleum floor, looking at the legs of the chairs and the dust bunnies in the corner, shaking with a terror that was absolute and real. I didn't come out for a long time. When I finally climbed back into my chair, I didn't look at them. I just sat there, my hands trembling, and I couldn't finish the meal. I felt the pity in their eyes, the heavy, awkward shame that hung over the room like smoke, and I knew then that I would never be able to tell them the truth, because the truth was a burden I had to carry alone. but there were moments, small, flickering instances of something else. I remember helping my brother fix his truck in the garage on a Saturday morning. The smell of the motor oil, the greasy tools, the way the light cut through the dust motes in the air, it was the same as it had been before, and for 10 minutes I wasn't a veteran of anything. I was just a man with a wrench, focused on a bolt that wouldn't turn, and we were laughing about some stupid thing that happened in high school. I caught myself mid-laugh, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, and I braced myself for the guilt, for the feeling that I didn't deserve to be standing there in the sun. But the guilt didn't come. Instead, there was just the warmth of the sun on my neck and the feeling of the heavy steel in my hand, and for those 10 minutes, the war was just a distant, muffled sound at the edge of my consciousness. It was a small, fragile, and absolutely necessary joy. I still have the days where the weight of it becomes too much to hold, where the walls seem to press in until I can barely draw a breath. I still check the exits when I walk into a restaurant, and I still don't drive over shadows in the road if I can help it. But the hope is there, tucked away under the layers of everything I don't talk about. It's in the way I look at the sunrise now, knowing that it's a gift that was never guaranteed to me. It's in the way I sit on the porch at night, listening to the crickets and the wind in the trees, no longer waiting for the explosion, but just listening to the world exist in its own, slow, steady pace. I am not the man who left Ohio, and I will never be that man again. That boy is gone, buried in a desert square, but there is a man standing here in his place, a man who knows that even when the light goes out, the sun has a way of coming back around. I look at my hands now, scarred and steady, and I don't see the boy who was afraid of the future. I see a man who has walked through the fire and didn't burn to ash. I have lost things I can never replace, and I have seen things I will never be able to forget, but I am still here. That has to count for something. It has to mean that the sacrifice, the loss, the horror, it all paved the way for this exact moment. I walk into the kitchen, the house quiet and bathed in the soft blue light of the pre-dawn, and I make a cup of coffee. I stand by the window, watching the streetlights flicker out one by one as the horizon begins to bleed into a pale, bruised purple. It is a quiet morning, a perfect, unremarkable American morning, and as the first bird starts to sing in the oak tree out back, I take a breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, clean and cool and full of the possibility of a brand new day. I am not fixed, and I am not the same, but I am standing. The coffee is hot, the house is still, and for the first time in a long time, the silence is not a threat, but a promise. I've learned that the only way to carry a memory like that is to keep living so that it doesn't get the last word.